Remember those forgotten cooking tricks? The ones that somehow made more meals with less money when every penny mattered? Back then, these tricks weren't just clever. They were how families fed everyone when the fridge was nearly empty and payday still days away. But if they worked so well, why did we stop using them? Potato peel crisps were not just a clever use of scraps. They were a survival tactic. Housewives during the Depression and wartime years knew that every part of the food they bought had value, and that included the skins they peeled off potatoes. Instead of tossing them in the bin, they would fry the peels in leftover lard or bacon grease until they curled and browned at the edges. A pinch of salt or a sprinkle of paprika could turn what used to be trash into a crunchy, savory treat that disappeared off the plate faster than you could refill it. This trick was genius in its simplicity. You were already peeling the potatoes anyway. Why not get a bonus snack out of it? Children loved them, and they made great companions to a bowl of soup or a plate of beans. Today, it might sound like a gourmet idea you would find at a fancy cafe, but back then, it was about survival. People who lived through those times never looked at a potato the same way again. And you can bet they never threw a peel away without thinking twice. It was flavor, frugality, and practicality, all in one crisp. Stale bread casseroles were the quiet champions of wartime kitchens. When bread went hard, you did not toss it. You turned it into dinner. Slices, heels, and crusts were cubed up and soaked in a simple mix of milk and eggs. Then, depending on what scraps you had lying around, you added bits of cheese, onion, cooked vegetables, maybe even a little bacon or sausage. The whole thing went into a baking dish and came out bubbling, golden, and incredibly satisfying. It was not flashy, but it filled the house with warmth and made a meal out of almost nothing. Housewives got creative, adding herbs, drippings, or even leftover gravy to give it body. You might think of this as a cross between bread pudding and quiche, but it had its own rustic identity. Sometimes it was dinner, sometimes breakfast, and sometimes both. In a time when nothing could be wasted, casseroles like this saved the day more than once. And when people say they miss real food, this is what they mean. Food that came from making do, stretching ingredients, and feeding a family with whatever you could pull from the shelf. Bacon grease jars sat next to stoves like treasured heirlooms. Every spoonful saved after frying bacon was liquid gold. Poured into old coffee tins or mason jars, the fat cooled and thickened into something creamy, smoky, and full of flavor. And back then, flavor was not something you could buy. It was something you saved. Bacon grease replaced oil, butter, or lard when money was tight. You used it to fry eggs, saute onions, or roast potatoes. You made gravy with it, added a spoonful to beans, or mixed it into cornbread for a richer bite. It was the secret ingredient that made cheap food taste rich. And there was a kind of pride in using every part of what you had. Families passed down bacon grease jars like wisdom, and you always knew which one held the good batch. Some people even claimed that food tasted better the second or third time the grease had been reused. It is the kind of trick that feels almost sacred now, because it reminds us how deeply people cared about their food, even when they had very little of it. Oatmeal was not just for breakfast. During lean years, it became a sneaky hero in the fight against hunger. You could mix dry oats into ground meat to stretch a pound into 2 or even 3. That meant more burgers, more meatloaf, more stews, and fewer nights going to bed hungry. The oats absorbed flavor and moisture, helping to bind the meat while giving it body and heartiness. Kids rarely noticed the difference, and parents counted it as a quiet win. In fact, for many families, oatmeal meatloaf became the standard, not the substitute. There was no shame in it, just smart cooking. This trick worked wonders with canned meats too. Luncheon meat, deviled ham, or even leftover roast could be chopped, mixed with oats, and turned into something new. You could season it how you liked, and it cooked up just like the real thing. Some people even got fancy and added chopped vegetables, herbs, or shredded cheese. But at its core, this was about making sure meat went further. Oatmeal might be humble, but during hard times, it gave people a little dignity, one meal at a time. Vegetable scrap soup stock was a bubbling pot of possibility. Onion ends, carrot tops, celery leaves, garlic skins, things you would normally toss, were collected in a freezer bag or bowl throughout the week. And when you had enough, you simmered them slowly in water, coaxing out every last drop of flavor. No bouillon cube could compare. This broth was smoky, earthy, rich with whatever you had on hand. It became the base for soups, stews, and even sauces. Some people threw in potato peels, corn cobs, mushroom stems. Nothing went to waste. If you were lucky enough to have bones, you could add those too. But even without them, the result was comforting. It was a way to honor the food you bought and stretch your grocery budget just a bit more. Some families added a dash of vinegar or a bay leaf passed down from Grandma's kitchen. You strained it, saved it, and used it all week. The trick was not just about thrift, it was about flavor. It taught generations how to cook deeply, patiently, and with intention. And once you made stock this way, store-bought broth never tasted quite right again. Mock apple pie with crackers was one of those desserts that made you do a double take. You would swear there were apples in it, tart, sweet, spiced just right. But open the crust, and there they were, plain old Ritz crackers. This was baking at its most resourceful. The trick was in the seasoning: lemon juice, sugar, cinnamon, and just a hint of cream of tartar. The crackers softened during baking and took on the exact texture of cooked apples. It fooled more than a few guests. During the Great Depression and World War II, apples were either too expensive or too seasonal to rely on. So bakers got clever. The result was a pie that tasted like home, even if it was built on pantry staples. People passed down the recipe like it was sacred because, in a way, it was. It reminded you that taste mattered, even when budgets were tight. And it proved that with a little creativity, you could still put something sweet on the table. That kind of trick stays with a family, and the memory of it, almost as good as the pie itself. Cabbage roll fillers were a masterclass in making a little go a long way. You started with a single head of cabbage, cheap, filling, and easy to stretch. Inside each leaf, you rolled up a spoonful of cooked rice and the smallest bit of meat you could spare. Sometimes it was beef, sometimes pork, and sometimes just whatever was left over from last night's dinner. That mixture was seasoned and bound together with onion, garlic, or tomato paste. Then you rolled it tight, lined it in a pan, and poured broth or tomato sauce on top. Bake it slow, and the flavors melted together into something cozy and filling. It was not just a dish, it was a strategy. You fed more mouths with less meat, and no one went hungry. Families of 8 or more survived on meals like this. You could freeze them, reheat them, and stretch the batch over days. It was comforting, affordable, and smart. Cabbage rolls reminded people that it is not what you have, it is what you do with it. And that lesson has never gone out of style. Breadcrumb thickened stews were the invisible trick behind so many full bellies. If a stew was looking thin or sparse, you did not panic. You grabbed the breadcrumb jar. Made from stale bread, crushed crackers, or even leftover biscuit crumbs, these fine little particles did more than soak up liquid. They added weight, richness, and texture. The stew suddenly became heartier, smoother, and felt more like a full meal. This was especially important when meat was scarce and vegetables were limited. A stew thickened with breadcrumbs felt like it had been simmering all day, even if it had only been on the stove for 20 minutes. It was a working-class technique, passed from hand to hand in kitchens that could not afford waste. Sometimes breadcrumbs were toasted first for extra flavor. Sometimes they were mixed with herbs or flour for a double boost. Whatever the method, the result was the same: a spoonful that felt like more. People would mop it up with bread heels or scoop it over mashed potatoes. It was one of those tricks that made a single pot of stew feel like a feast. Cold roast sandwich tricks were born from Sunday planning and Monday hunger. You roasted a chicken, beef, or pork shoulder for the weekend dinner, then rationed it carefully for sandwiches the rest of the week. Thin slices were layered on homemade bread with mustard, pickles, and any gravy you had left. If there was stuffing, even better. The trick was to slice the meat while it was cold so it held its shape, then layer it generously with sauces to stretch every bite. No one wanted dry leftovers, so cooks used lettuce leaves, mashed potatoes, or coleslaw to add moisture. It was not just a sandwich. It was a memory of the weekend meal, wrapped in wax paper and packed into lunchboxes. Some folks even wrapped cold roasts in tortillas or crepes if they had them. Kids traded these sandwiches at school. Adults looked forward to them during long shifts, and every bit of that original roast was used, down to the bones for broth. In a time when food had to last, cold roast sandwiches made sure nothing was wasted and no one felt like they were eating scraps. Rice pudding leftovers were the reward for a week of tight meal planning. That last scoop of rice sitting in the pot? It had a second life. Add milk, sugar, cinnamon, and maybe a dash of nutmeg, and suddenly you had dessert. Some people stirred in raisins, others swirled in jam or a splash of vanilla. Cooked low and slow, the rice softened further, soaking up the sweet milk and turning into something creamy and nostalgic. It was warm, it was comforting, and it came from scraps that might have otherwise gone to waste. For a lot of families, rice pudding was the only sweet thing they got all week. You did not need eggs, butter, or anything fancy. Just leftovers and a little care. Grandparents remembered it with fondness. Kids asked for it by name. It tasted like home, even if the cupboards were close to empty. And that is the kind of cooking trick that sticks with you, not just in your recipe book, but in your memory. Hot dog coins in beans were a weeknight miracle in many households. You did not need a pound of meat, just one hot dog, sliced thin like little coins, sizzling into a pan of canned baked beans. It was a visual trick and a flavor one too. Every bite looked like it had meat in it, even though the real amount was barely enough to count. But it worked. The hot dog flavor melted into the beans, giving the entire pot that smoky, savory kick you craved after a long day. Kids loved the round little bites, and parents appreciated the extra protein on a tight budget. You could serve it with toast, spoon it over rice, or wrap it up in a slice of bread like a quick burrito. Some even added mustard or chopped onion to boost the flavor without boosting the cost. This trick showed just how far one hot dog could go if you got a little creative. It was not glamorous, but it filled bellies and made people smile. And that is what mattered most in a house where every meal was counted and every plate needed to satisfy. Canned milk whipped into frosting was a sweet trick that came out of pure necessity. Butter was expensive, sometimes impossible to find. So home bakers got creative with what they did have. Evaporated milk. When chilled and whipped with sugar, vanilla, or cocoa powder, it turned into a fluffy, spreadable frosting that looked and tasted like something far more indulgent. You did not need cream, you did not need butter, just a steady hand and a little faith. It worked best if you beat the milk until it formed soft peaks, then slowly added the sugar. Some people even threw in a spoon of cornstarch to help it hold. The result? Cakes, cookies, and celebration desserts that still felt special, even if they came from a shelf-stable can. It was used on birthdays, school events, and Sunday treats. The frosting tasted a little lighter, a little milkier, but in a way that was honest. It did not try to hide its roots. It was a frosting made by people who made do. A frosting that meant your family was still celebrating something, no matter how tight things were. Gelatin mold meals might seem strange now, but during tight times they were smart, flashy, and efficient. Housewives needed a way to stretch tiny portions of meat or vegetables into something that looked like a complete dish, and gelatin was the answer. You would boil whatever scraps you had, ham bits, canned peas, leftover carrots, and suspend them in savory or mildly sweet gelatin, then mold it all into a dish that sliced clean and fed many. It looked impressive on a table, especially during community potlucks or church suppers. Even better, it kept for days in the icebox and used minimal ingredients. It was not just about convenience, it was also about presentation. A molded dish said, "We cared enough to try," even if the contents were humble. Some versions included tuna or shredded chicken, set in lemon or vinegar-spiked gel. Others were more like layered salads, with mayonnaise folded into the base. These gelatin creations made the ordinary feel fancy. And for families scraping by, That little bit of ceremony mattered more than you might think. Reused pickle juice marinades were one of the sneakiest flavor tricks in the Depression-era kitchen. When a jar of pickles was emptied, most people dumped the juice down the drain, but not thrifty cooks. That briny, spiced liquid was bursting with flavor, and it still had work to do. You could pour it over chicken or pork and let it sit overnight for a free marinade that was tangy, salty, and rich with spice. Some added it to coleslaw for a quick punch of vinegar without wasting fresh seasoning. Others stirred it into potato salad to stretch the dressing without extra mustard or mayo. You could even toss hard-boiled eggs into it to make pickled eggs without a new recipe. Nothing was wasted. Pickle juice became part of the flavor toolkit, not just the leftover mess. It brought zest and acidity into kitchens that could not afford lemons or vinegar bottles every week. And it helped cooks feel a bit clever, a bit sneaky, like they had found a shortcut the store could never sell. Stretch-a chicken soup was not just a meal, it was a method. One roast chicken could become 3 or 4 meals if you played it right. First, you carved off the best cuts for Sunday dinner. Then came the sandwich meat, shredded and dressed up for Monday. Finally, when the bones were nearly bare, you dropped them into a pot with onion peels, carrot ends, and water, and waited. That broth, rich from every last ounce of flavor the bird could offer, became the base for soup. Add in rice, beans, noodles, or chopped vegetables, and you had a hearty pot that could feed the whole family again. Sometimes you even added a little milk or flour to thicken it. Some versions were creamy, others brothy. But all of them shared the same proud trick: turning scraps into comfort. It taught generations to look twice at what was left on the cutting board, and to never underestimate the power of a good stock pot. Cornmeal mush was a dish with 2 lives. In the morning, it was soft, hot, and spooned into bowls like porridge, served with milk, syrup, or just a pat of butter if you had it. But the real trick came later. Leftovers were poured into a loaf pan and chilled until firm. At dinner time, you sliced the loaf into slabs and pan-fried them in bacon grease until golden and crispy on the outside, tender on the inside. It was cornmeal, water, and salt. Bare bones ingredients, but the texture transformation made it feel like something new. It could be savory or sweet. Some people added cheese, others served it with eggs or stewed tomatoes. And the best part? You only had to cook once. It was cheap, filling, and flexible. In tight times, cornmeal mush taught families to see one food in many ways. And that is the kind of lesson that sticks with you for life. Eggless mayonnaise cakes were a Depression-era marvel. When eggs were scarce or too expensive, people reached for a jar of mayonnaise and discovered it could do the job just as well. After all, mayonnaise is just eggs and oil in disguise. Mixed into cake batter, it made the crumb moist, rich, and surprisingly indulgent. Chocolate mayonnaise cake became a staple for birthday parties and Sunday suppers. It was easy, pantry-friendly, and did not taste like mayonnaise at all. The trick was to cream it in with the sugar before adding the dry ingredients. No one suspected a thing. It baked up beautifully, often without needing frosting at all. But if you had a little powdered sugar or whipped canned milk, it became a full celebration cake. This was not a compromise, it was a reinvention. It showed that even in lean times, a proper dessert was still within reach, and it gave people a new kind of confidence in their own kitchen. Cabbage pancakes, known in some homes as Depression slaw cakes, were born out of the need to stretch a single head of cabbage across multiple meals. Grated cabbage was mixed with flour, a beaten egg, salt, and a bit of water to form a loose batter. Then it was dropped by the spoonful into a hot skillet and fried until crisp on the edges and tender in the middle. Think of it like a savory fritter, only built from scraps. You could spice it up with onion, herbs, or garlic if you had them. You could add leftover potatoes or a few shreds of carrot. But at its core, this was about taking the cheapest vegetable in the house and making it taste like something special. It was served with mustard, vinegar, or even a dab of ketchup. And it fed a table without anyone asking, "Where's the meat?" The sound of it frying, the smell in the kitchen, the crisp bite, it all added up to something greater than the sum of its parts. Leftover pie dough turnovers were a sweet little reward for the cook. After making a full pie, there were always scraps of dough left behind, edges trimmed from the crust or bits that could not quite stretch to cover the pan. But instead of tossing them, you rolled them back out, cut them into small rounds or squares, and filled them with whatever was around. Apples, jam, raisins, chopped nuts, or sometimes even savory fillings like mashed potatoes or onions. Folded over, crimped shut, and baked until golden, these turnovers were like tiny hand pies made from scraps. Brushed with milk or sprinkled with sugar, they looked polished enough to serve at tea. But they were born of thrift. They were the cook's snack, the after-dinner nibble, or the next-day lunchbox surprise. Children loved them. Parents felt proud of them. And in a kitchen where nothing was ever wasted, they reminded everyone that leftovers could still bring joy. Wartime mock meatloaf was an art form of budget cuisine. You might have had only a handful of ground meat, barely enough to fill a teacup, but that did not mean you could not make a loaf. Enter lentils, breadcrumbs, oats, grated vegetables, and whatever spices or herbs you had on hand. The meat was more of a flavoring than a base. It tied everything together and gave the illusion of a full, protein-rich meal. You baked it in a loaf pan, sliced it like a real meatloaf, and served it with ketchup or gravy to complete the look. Some cooks added powdered soup mix or tomato paste for extra punch. It was moist, savory, and far more satisfying than it had any right to be. You could make sandwiches from it, serve it with mashed potatoes, or reheat slices for breakfast with a fried egg. Mock meatloaf did not pretend to be gourmet, but it fed hungry mouths, stretched ingredients, and proved that even a fake dish could be full of real comfort. Rice and raisin skillet porridge was the kind of dish that made a sparse pantry feel like a full one. You just needed cooked rice, water or milk, a handful of raisins, and a pinch of sugar or cinnamon if you had it. Toss it all into a skillet, warm it gently, and stir until everything blended into a creamy, comforting mixture. It worked for breakfast, it worked for supper, and best of all, it cost almost nothing. Raisins were shelf-stable and often bought in bulk, and rice was one of the cheapest, most filling staples in any home. The combination was sweet, mild, and soft enough for kids or the elderly to enjoy. Some added a spoon of butter. Others stirred in powdered milk or condensed milk to make it richer. It was gentle on the stomach and warming in cold weather, and unlike more complicated meals, it came together in minutes. In homes where money was tight and time was tighter, this dish showed up again and again. It made people feel cared for, even when ingredients were scarce. The scent of cinnamon and warm raisins still brings a certain comfort today, long after the need has passed. Stuffed baked potatoes with odds and ends turned leftovers into something brand new. You would bake a few potatoes, then scoop out the insides and mix them with whatever you had on hand. Vegetable scraps, crumbled bacon, bits of ham, shredded cheese, or even last night's casserole. Then you stuffed that filling back into the hollowed skins, baked them again, and served them like a fresh main course. It was like making a new meal out of yesterday's scraps, and no one felt like they were just eating reheated leftovers. You could spice them up with mustard, herbs, or garlic powder if you had it. Some people mashed the scooped-out potato with powdered milk or a little broth to make it creamy. Others just stirred everything together and hoped for the best. Either way, it was hearty, frugal, and satisfying. You only needed a few potatoes to fill an entire table. And if you had kids, it was one of those rare meals that felt fun and new, even if the ingredients were anything but. A twice-baked potato was a little surprise in the middle of a rough week. Split pea patties were humble, but they worked wonders on an empty stomach. You soaked or boiled dried split peas until they were tender, then mashed them with flour, onion, and maybe a little seasoning if it was around. Once the mixture came together, you shaped it into patties and fried them until the outside was golden and crisp. The inside stayed soft, earthy, and full of protein. They were a vegetarian meal that did not feel like a compromise. Cheap, filling, and easy to prepare, split pea patties made an appearance in homes where meat was either too expensive or just unavailable. You could serve them with a spoonful of mustard or gravy, stack them into sandwiches, or crumble them over salad greens. They soaked up flavor well and held together better than you might expect. Some recipes added breadcrumbs or grated carrot for extra texture. Others just kept it plain and simple. Either way, they fed a lot of people on very little money, and they did it with quiet grace. Pan-fried flour tortillas with sugar and butter were the emergency dessert you always had room for. If you had a bit of flour and water, you could make a simple dough. Roll it flat, cook it in a hot skillet until bubbly and golden, then spread with a pat of butter and sprinkle with sugar. Fold it over like a taco, and there it was, a warm, sweet treat with almost no cost. Some families added cinnamon or vanilla if they had it. Others topped it with jam or drizzled syrup. But the heart of the dish was the dough itself, chewy, crisp in spots, and always comforting. It was a lifesaver during weeks when there was nothing left for cookies or cake, and kids never saw it as a second-rate snack. It tasted like something special. It was a sweet moment in a tough day, proof that even pantry basics could deliver joy. For many people, it was the first dessert they ever learned to make, and the memory of it lingers long after childhood fades. Macaroni with tomato juice sauce was what happened when pasta night met a tight grocery budget. Instead of canned sauce or crushed tomatoes, you reached for that humble bottle of tomato juice, cheaper, thinner, but still full of flavor. You boiled macaroni until tender, then simmered it in a saucepan with tomato juice, a little butter or oil, and whatever spices you had: salt, pepper, garlic powder, anything to give it depth. Sometimes you thickened it with a pinch of flour or cornstarch. Sometimes you just let it stay brothy. Either way, it coated the noodles and turned them into something warm, red, and surprisingly satisfying. A spoonful of grated cheese on top was a bonus, not a given. But even without it, the dish filled you up. It was one of those meals that felt like a cousin to spaghetti, even if it came from very different means. It was proof that flavor did not have to come from a jar, and dinner did not have to be expensive to be good. Homemade cracker crumbs were the quiet MPVS of Depression-era kitchens. When boxed breadcrumbs were out of reach or just did not exist, you took old saltines, wrapped them in a towel, and crushed them under a rolling pin. That was your breading for fried chicken, pork chops, fish cakes, or even vegetables. It was light, crispy, and stuck beautifully with just a dip in egg or milk. Cracker crumbs could also top casseroles, bulk up meatloaf, or thicken soups. If you were feeling fancy, you seasoned them with dried herbs or garlic powder. But most of the time, they went in just as they were: salty, plain, and dependable. Even the slightly stale crackers worked best. Nothing was wasted, and everything had a second chance. Moms passed down cracker crumb recipes like they were sacred, because in those times they were. This trick made your meals go further. And best of all, it cost you nothing but a few crumbs and a bit of muscle. Apple core jelly was a masterpiece of zero-waste cooking. After slicing apples for pie or applesauce, you were left with peels and cores, and that was exactly what you needed to make jelly. You tossed the scraps into a pot with water and boiled them until every bit of flavor was coaxed out. Then you strained the liquid, added sugar and pectin, and simmered it down until it turned into something glossy and golden. The taste was delicate, like a whisper of apple with a hint of tartness. It was not as bold as jam, but it was perfect on toast, biscuits, or as a glaze over cakes. Some versions added lemon juice or cinnamon. Others kept it plain and pure. The trick was knowing how to spot potential in the things most people threw away. Apple core jelly turned trash into treasure. And it proved that if you paid attention, your kitchen scraps could still make something beautiful. 2-ingredient corn fritters were the definition of simple, filling, and fast. All you needed was a can of corn and a scoop of flour. Mix them together into a thick batter, drop it into a hot skillet, and fry until each side was golden brown and crisp around the edges. That was it. No eggs, no milk, no fancy tools. Just pantry staples, heat, and hunger. The corn gave a sweet pop in every bite, and the flour crisped up just enough to hold it all together. You could eat them for breakfast, lunch, or a snack, plain, salted, or with a drizzle of syrup if you wanted. In homes where fresh ingredients were rare and money was even rarer, this recipe felt like magic. You could double or triple it with ease, feeding a whole family from one can. And you never needed a reason to make them. Corn fritters were a go-to comfort on days when everything else was uncertain. Meat drippings over rice were how working families turned simple staples into something rich and satisfying. After roasting a chicken, searing beef, or frying sausage, you never let the drippings go to waste. That browned, seasoned fat collected in the bottom of the pan was scooped out, saved, and poured over hot rice. Sometimes it was just that, drippings and rice. Other times, people added a splash of broth, a few scraps of meat, or a cooked vegetable if it was handy. The fat gave flavor, the rice gave fullness, and together they turned into a warm, savory meal that filled the belly and soothed the mind. In households where meat was a luxury, this trick made sure its flavor went as far as possible. You did not need much, just a few tablespoons to transform plain rice into dinner. It was a quiet little ritual that made a hard day end a little better. Day-old donut pudding was proof that even a stale store-bought treat could find new life. When donuts lost their fluff and went dry, you chopped them into cubes and soaked them in a simple custard made from milk, sugar, and an egg or two. Then you baked it all until the top was golden and the inside set like bread pudding. The glaze on the donuts melted into the custard, creating pockets of sweetness throughout the dish. Cinnamon, nutmeg, or vanilla could be added if you had them, but even without extras, the result was delicious. It was soft, rich, and just sweet enough to feel like dessert. You could serve it warm or cold, with cream or plain. Some people even sprinkled it with powdered sugar before serving. It was a way to rescue something that felt like a loss and turn it into something worth looking forward to. In a time when nothing could be wasted, donut pudding reminded people that joy could still be found at the bottom of the bread box. Rock boiling is one of those lost arts that feels almost too wild to be real, but it absolutely was, and it still works today if you know how to do it. Picture this. You have no metal pot, no pan, nothing but a fire, a handful of food, and a riverbank full of stones. Native American cooks would heat large, clean rocks directly in the fire until they were almost glowing, then carefully drop them into hollowed-out bowls made of bark, animal hide, or clay. The heat from the stones would bring the water to a bubbling boil almost instantly, allowing them to cook stews, boil roots, or even prepare medicinal teas without ever burning the vessel. It was a skill that could mean the difference between an empty belly and a full one. And it was not just functional. It gave the food a subtle mineral richness you cannot replicate any other way. Today, rock boiling feels almost mythical, a forgotten page from a cookbook written by the earth itself. And speaking of earth, some of the most astonishing bread you have never tasted was baked without an oven, without a pan, and sometimes without anything more than a pile of hot ashes. Grandmas thought that rolling pins were pretty essential to a good baking session. You could not go a day without seeing one be put to use, as it was just a very multi-purpose tool that helped in every way possible. You could flatten dough with them, roll out a pie crust or a tart crust, as well as the doughs for cookies. You could get cookie dough to a very precise thickness with a rolling pin, and many a wonderful batch of gingerbread, shortbread, and red velvet cookies, which were really popular back then, were rolled out thanks to these pins. In the hands of an amateur, they may not be the best tool, but in the hands of a veteran home chef that has been rolling and baking for most of their life, there was arguably no tool better than these pins. If you even needed to make croissants, puff pastry, or donuts, you could use rolling pins. And if you wanted to save a little on birthday costs by baking a cake at home, that was pretty easy thanks to a grandma who knew how to work a pin. So, you're all no stranger to the concept of heat being really good at sterilizing things. That goes for pretty much every kind of food you've ever had, but it also goes for your bottles too. Why? Well, heat actually kills a lot more things than you might know. It kills pretty much any kind of bacteria, virus, and fungi. And while I'm not trying to imply you wouldn't know that, what I do think is that people, myself included, aren't aware of just how many bacteria there are on surfaces around us. Actually, the number is staggering. They all die of around 212 degrees Fahrenheit though, and that's the temperature of boiling water. This helps to completely obliterate most of these organisms on a cellular level, which is pretty metal if you ask me. The high temperature literally breaks them down into nothing, and they either become inactive because structurally they either just can't work anymore or they are outright killed. Pretty neat, right? Not only do you end up getting your water bottles sterilized, but they end up becoming as clean as they can be too. On the other hand, pemmican is a traditional food developed by indigenous peoples of North America. They were a very ideal way to preserve meat, fat, and berries all in one for long-term storage, and it's probably one of the earliest examples we have of portable food that was put in a compact form because it needed to. It was ideal for travel, trading, and quick consumption, all factors that American industries and companies would keep in mind going forward. How does all this work, though? Bison, deer, and elk are all good sources of lean meat and were herded by indigenous peoples for a long time. All the meat from these animals would be dried, either through sun-drying it or through smoking it. In place of that, rendered fat like tallow would be mixed with the powdered dried meat, and this would seal the meat, preventing any air from interacting with it and excess moisture ruining the drying process. Berries also would contain acidic compounds and antioxidants that would help kill microbe activity overall and help reduce spoilage, and the final mix of this would be molded into cakes and balls and put into compact containers. If you made pemmican properly, it could actually last all year or even more than that, and it was packed with all kinds of nutrition that were important for a nomadic lifestyle. In short, this was a wonder food, and it was built to take care of everything you would need nutritionally. Clay pot slow cooking was not just a recipe. It was a way of pulling flavor out of the earth itself. Native American communities would form thick-walled pots from river clay, baking them slowly in open fires until they were strong enough to hold the richest stews and slow-roasted meats you can imagine. The secret was patience. Cooking meat in these pots over smoldering coals allowed the juices to stay trapped inside, cycling through the dish again and again, infusing every bite with pure, concentrated flavor. No fancy Dutch oven, no stainless steel miracle cookware. Just ancient craftsmanship and a bond with nature so strong you could taste it. The slow, even heat of a clay pot gave even the toughest cuts of meat a tenderness you would not believe unless you had tried it. In a world before timers and thermostats, this was real mastery. And the taste? It was as close to magic as food can get. But clay was not the only tool they used to summon incredible flavors. Sometimes, the real secret was hidden in something even lighter than air, something that grew tall all around them: corn husks. Floral china had a bit of a renaissance in the 20th century, and those crockpots always looked good with it. This was because Victorian design trends started having a big focus on ornate and floral prints, and china manufacturers listened as soon as the trend popped up. They wanted to put out more and more floral designs to attract more of an audience, and they especially wanted to get ahead early in the rat race involving dinnerware sets. These sets started becoming very widespread, and most would come with floral designs, and it was like a whole new market with untapped sales for a lot of producers. As a result, you had every house loaded with matching fine china sets that always looked like a painting, or had every kind of flower you had seen in your life on a different plate. Pre-freezing pies really helps before you delve deep into that baking rabbit hole, and it's for two reasons. You get a much flakier crust, which I'm assuming is something you want, and the fillings also stay really even, which I know you want. So, there are some sciencey reasons behind why this happens, and we'll definitely be getting into them. But if you're here for the too long, didn't read the version, then basically, moisture control, temperature regulation, and it helps keep the fat. Now, for the actual explanation. So, pie dough has a lot of cold fat, and that's what helps make that really flaky texture in the first place. Pre-freezing helps to solidify that fact and make sure the fat remains as solid as it can be, and the fat hopefully maintains its structure too. Plus, when you usually bake a pie without freezing it, the soft, soggy, and moist filling can keep the bottom crust really soggy. And this is a problem because you always want a firm base for your pie. The cold temperature of a pie that's been pre-frozen is an entirely different ballgame, though. This helps slow the process down in the oven, and overall, the fat at the bottom of the dough solidifies before the filling has a chance to soften it up. The filling itself is also getting more set and firm, and that's because being frozen helps keep it in a solid state, which helps make sure that it cooks more evenly. So, just a small trip in the freezer can give your pie the pick-me-up it needed, huh? Lye curing your fish has been the alkaline all-rounder for all your fish preservation-related needs for centuries. This traditional preservation method takes full advantage of lye and shows you just how much of an MVP it really is. This process actually goes back to the very early times of Asian cultures, and the reason behind how this works is pretty interesting. Lye as an alkaline solution raises the pH level of a fish by like 2 folds, and this would typically look like the fish being treated in a diluted solution of lye that's been mixed with water and salt. Basically, fish has a lot of protein in it, which, is no surprise, right? What you might not know is that the alkalinity of lye disrupts that protein and makes it a lot more resistant to spoilage. It changes the whole structure, so now you don't just have protein, you have protein pro. Get it? I'll see myself out. Anyway, it doesn't just do those enhancements. It also boosts your catch of the day's resistance to those filthy microbes that keep popping up every 2 minutes. Pretty neat, right? The original food dehydrators were not made of wires, plastic, or electricity. They were built from nothing but wood, patience, and the heat of the sun itself. Native Americans constructed simple wooden frames, stretching thin strips of meat across them like rough tapestries. Exposed to sunlight and fresh air, the meat would dry slowly, losing its moisture but locking in all the rich, smoky flavor. Sometimes the process was sped up by adding a small, smoldering fire nearby, helping to drive off insects and give the meat an even deeper taste. It was a way of preserving precious food without ice, salt, or chemicals, and the result was nothing short of incredible. Chewy, flavorful strips that could last for weeks or even months. Every bite told a story of the land it came from. Every piece was survival packed into a pocket-sized meal. Jerky might be trendy today, but it started here, with hands stretching meat under a fierce sun and trusting the earth to do the rest. But when it came to sweetening up meals and treats, they had another secret up their sleeves, and it did not involve sugar at all. Wooden spoon collections were also a very typical sight in America during the 20th century. A lot of these things got as popular as they did because they lasted so long, and were also pretty durable. Nowadays, it is very easy to get a replacement for something if it breaks or something goes wrong, but it was more of an inconvenience then. Wooden spoons didn't melt or warp even with daily exposure to heat, so they were used in nearly every aspect of cooking. Besides the practicalities of all of it, the aesthetic appeal was also really out there. They went along with most of the interior of homes back then, which was pretty wood-oriented, and the rustic charm and warm, dulcet tones of a well-stacked collection of wooden spoons really brought it all together. It's when the little things come together that a place really shines, you know? Chilled bowls are actually fantastic for placing your whipping cream in because the cold temperatures here really help in keeping the fat in the cream stable. Why is the stability of the fat of your whipping cream a subject you may want to be invested in? Well, that's because unlike keeping a stable diet or sleep schedule, the effects this time around are a lot more immediate. Whipping cream is made up of a lot of fat molecules that get suspended in the water. That's what happens when you whip the cream. Those molecules start clumping together and make what you see. At room temperature even, this fat can start to melt, and it means you lose the texture of whipping cream when it's at its best. If you chill the bowl though, you don't get this problem because the fat actually stays firm and helps the foam keep its shape. Pretty interesting, right? I know I like my whipping cream at tip-top performance, and if you do too, maybe you want to keep this one in mind. If you would bury root vegetables in the crown, then you were literally taking advantage of the natural regulation of the earth. This was a common practice that people did to keep vegetables as fresh as they could be and extend their shelf life, and it was something you'd see a lot throughout the winter. Basically, in the colder months, since the ground tends to maintain a consistently cool temperature, it helps slow the metabolic process of most vegetables down. This helps to stave off the decaying process, but the temperature of the soil during the winter is actually a lot lower than you think. It's literally just a few degrees Fahrenheit above the freezing point, and this way, not only do you get to preserve your fruit, but the overall nutritional content and texture get preserved too. Most vegetables also really need to be hydrated properly, or they'll shrivel up and die, and soil acts as a natural wellspring of moisture, so you get that covered easily. Cactus as a natural tenderizer sounds almost too strange to believe, but it was an everyday trick in many native kitchens. Certain varieties, like prickly pear, are packed with natural enzymes that break down tough muscle fibers in meat. By rubbing raw cactus slices over a piece of game meat, or even marinating it in cactus juice, they could turn chewy, sinewy cuts into tender, flavorful meals that needed almost no extra cooking. It was pure kitchen magic, pulled straight from the harshest landscapes. In places where hunting was hard and every scrap of meat mattered, this trick was not just clever, it was survival. No waste, no frustration, just another example of how nature handed over its secrets to those who knew how to listen. The best part is that cactus does not mask the flavor of the meat. It simply softens it, letting the real richness shine through. Even today, modern chefs have started waking up to this forgotten genius. But it was not just fresh meals that mattered. When you needed to carry food across miles of wilderness, you needed another skill altogether: the incredible art of sun-drying meats under the open sky. Butter dishes with lids were something that you would find in almost every household. Just like you would walk in most homes today and expect to find a coffee maker or a deep fryer, back then, in the age of our grandparents, butter dishes were very popular ways of storing the spread. You would keep them at room temperature instead of in the fridge, so they were always soft and spreadable, and you would protect them from any dirt. These existed even before the time of accessible and affordable refrigeration, and they were made from glass or ceramic. Usually they would be pretty fashionable too, with lots of unique designs and ornate detail put into them. Speaking of fridges, how did people preserve things before they came around? Because keeping everything in a prison of ice was not ideal either. So, you really want that aesthetically perfect slice of cake, right? The one that looks like it's right out of a TV ad? The one that just looks wonderfully symmetrical and like it was cut by a pro? You can't get that with a knife, despite what the TV shows. We've all been there, friend. I'll let you in on a little secret too. They probably don't use knives either. When you start with a knife, especially if the blade is dull or blunt, then the pressure that the knife gives off might cause some pretty uneven compression throughout the cake. This can happen because of the knife or just you using too much force, but whatever the cause, you get uneven slices as a result. However, you don't get this problem with a string line. Know why? String lines create uniform pressure across the entire surface of the cake. You can pull the cake through the cake without much force either, unlike a knife, where you'd kind of have to try to push down. These two factors make string lines almost irreplaceable when it comes to slicing cake, because it means you get the most even slice with the least amount of force. Also, have you ever noticed the way cake sticks to knives? Strings don't really have that problem because of their thinness. Knives, on the other hand, are prone to dragging a lot of the cake with them. Now, you've probably heard your grandmother emphasize the importance of always keeping your pasta dry. But have you ever thought about why that is? The thing with drying pasta is that besides just avoiding basic issues like how it clumps together, becomes the worst thing ever to eat, and just loses its freshness, you really just want to preserve pasta because of one simple concept: moisture content. Like we've discussed before, moisture is something that bacteria and mold need desperately to grow. If they don't get it, they're liable to have a breakdown, figuratively and literally. This is why drying pasta has been such a tradition in Italian culture and just about everywhere that popularly consumes it. Drying your pasta reduces the water content by a good 15%, and that helps the pasta achieve a much higher shelf life. I'm talking months, and if you really know how to preserve, then even years. Don't believe me? Trust me, there's an Italian on YouTube with an essay on it. Using ash to soften beans faster without soaking overnight sounds like a wild trick from another world, but for Native American cooks, it was just another part of making the impossible work. In times when waiting 12 hours for beans to soften was not an option, they found a genius shortcut that we have almost completely forgotten: By adding clean wood ash into the pot, the alkaline properties would work their way into the beans, breaking down the tough outer skins and speeding up the softening process. It was not just about saving time either. In many ways, it was about survival. A quicker meal could mean a safer night, a full stomach before a long journey, or simply a little more freedom in a hard world. Even today, chefs who understand this trick know that beans softened this way have a richer, earthier flavor you simply cannot get from a modern soak. It is a reminder that real food was about more than recipes. It was about trust in the land itself. And if you think cooking with ash is clever, wait until you see what they did with clay and fire to make meat so tender it would almost melt in your hands. Butter curlers were another little trinket that saw a lot of use in most households, thanks to the simple benefits of life it would let you enjoy, like very pretty-looking butter. Some home chefs were much more focused on presentation, decoration, and maintaining the ambiance with the look of their food than others. They always had butter curlers handy because at formal meals or dinner parties, this elevated the entire mood because of how good it could make your food look. Homes that had hosting and entertaining as a priority always had curlers around, and nowadays some still use them because of the flexibility it gives you. With butter curlers, you could get more controlled and moderate curls of butter out instead of large spreads that really burned through your stock and had you running to the grocer's again and again. Cloth bags can actually help your cheese age just right, and I bet that sounds like a really weird mix to you, but it's as legitimate as a mix can be. The right conditions for aging all happen inside the wonderful confines of a cloth bag, so you have that for one. Basically, to age cheese and to age it properly, you need three different things. You need moisture that's regulated, and you need a lot of air circulation. None of that means anything if your environment isn't clean, so you need to be able to prevent contamination as well as you can. Moisture regulation is really important because as it keeps aging, then cheese starts losing moisture. Cloth bags, on the other hand, are made of really breathable material and help moisture to evaporate a bit more slowly so that the cheese doesn't get too dry. Cheese aging also helps keep air balanced since the cloth bag is really porous. All those tiny little openings help air to flow around the cheese, which you really need for the health of the rind. It helps for those helpful little bacteria and molds that you find on cheese to grow. Some of those microorganisms don't deserve to die in a heat death. They make your burger a lot better. Third of all, the bag itself just works as a natural barrier against any kind of dirty substance, insect, or material. All in all, you get a perfect vibe for your cheese. So, this one might take you for a spin, and I'm not sure if most of you would even be familiar with the concept. Potting your butter is a pretty historical technique, but not one that's especially popular in United States history or culture. The idea this time around is to take something like a jar or a crock and store your butter in that, and then cover it with a generous layer of clarified fat. This can either be lard or the clarified fat that comes from the butter itself, but the reason for doing this is that the layer acts as a seal. It helps to keep the butter fresh, and that's because the water and milk solids from butter are removed. What you get is pure, unadulterated butterfat left. Since it is pure, it's less likely to spoil in comparison to whole butter. Protecting it from the air also does the usual routine of keeping it safe from airborne germs and microbes. People used to do this a lot because in rural areas, even when refrigeration was a thing, it hadn't become a widespread or accessible practice. In cold places, for example, the mountain ranges here, storing these pots in dark basements would help push the shelf life up even more. Fish wrapped in leaves and steamed over coals was a method so simple and brilliant that it feels almost sacred now. Native American cooks would gather wide, sturdy leaves like those from corn, squash, or even certain wild plants, and use them as natural steam pockets. A freshly caught fish, often seasoned with wild herbs and crushed berries, would be carefully wrapped and placed near smoldering coals or atop heated stones. As the heat rose, the moisture trapped inside the leaves would slowly steam the fish, keeping it impossibly tender, flaky, and infused with the faint, earthy flavor of the leaves themselves. When the leaves were finally peeled back, what you found inside was a dish so fresh and alive you could almost taste the river still running through it. Meals like these were more than food. They were rituals of respect for the land. And speaking of sacred gifts from the earth, Few treasures were more important to survival and celebration than the humble acorn ground and transformed into something that would feed generations. JellO molds were a typical 20th century snack that let people get creative and fashionable with their desserts. You could use them for gelatin-based dishes or jelly bowls and cakes, and they were very common at parties and family gatherings. Of course, the kids in particular enjoyed JellO molds the most out of everyone else, even if they had no idea how to use them to shape the JellO properly. That is probably why every grandma always had some of these though, so that when their grandkids eventually did come over, they could enjoy playing around with their food a little before. After all, they would probably get scolded for doing so at home. To be honest, most JellO mold brands got really popular in the 1960s in particular as they became a convenient trend since JellO was also getting more and more popular. Have you ever heard of turning a milk jar into a butter maker? I bet you haven't, because if I'm being totally honest with you, I didn't know either. Yet the process of churning really helps to keep the cream from separating from the fat that you find in the buttermilk. The milk jar, since it's a glass container with an airtight seal, can even help to churn the butter. I'll tell you why. Butter is made when you basically irritate heavy cream and violently shake it until the point that the cream starts to mix together and stick. Then, you take the liquid and separate it, and that is how you get buttermilk. Milk jars end up being the ideal choice for this because they can hold cream really well and also handle the amount of violent churning and shaking you need to really create the butter. The churning is what causes the cream to start turning into butter, and the tight seal really helps you keep the moisture you need to retain the texture. Honey preservation is basically one of the few bounties of nature that will almost never betray you. It's good for your skin. It helps to boost your gut health. It doesn't ever go bad. And now I'm going to tell you all about how it preserves itself better than anything else. So, the thing with honey is that the super low moisture content in honey basically makes it impossible for any of the icky and nasty stuff we've gone over so far to grow or even get a chance to come into existence. Honey's also really acidic, and it falls anywhere between 3.2 and 4.5 on the pH scale. This helps to curb stomp the growth of any gross bacteria and fungi, so it's got a natural preservative quality in that. Anything that's got a strong acidic background naturally will do that. But honey works better for a few other reasons, like how honey naturally exudes something called glucose oxidase. When you combine this with just glucose, or sugar, you get hydrogen peroxide. This is a natural microbe hunter, and it basically destroys bacteria on site. Honey has a high sugar content already and is largely made up entirely of glucose and fructose, so go figure. Long story short, the thing is just built different and built strong. Sweetening with birch bark was one of the most ingenious and almost completely forgotten cooking secrets passed down through native traditions. Long before refined sugar ever touched American soil, Native American cooks knew that certain birch trees contained a natural, subtle sweetness hidden within their sap and inner bark. By carefully harvesting thin strips and boiling them down, they created a lightly sweet syrup or infusion that could flavor drinks, breads, and even savory dishes without overwhelming them. It was a sweetness that whispered rather than shouted, blending seamlessly with the smoky, rich flavors of open-fire cooking. Even today, a few remote communities and experimental chefs are bringing birch syrup back to the table, rediscovering a depth of flavor that supermarket sugar can never hope to match. But when it came to cooking full meals without pots or pans, there was one natural vessel that changed everything: giant pumpkins, hollowed out and transformed into Earth's own slow cookers. Something that was really common as a bit of decoration in households back then was a teapot. In a sense, it has lost the same love it had in its golden days where people only used teapots for storing their freshly brewed tea, since microwaves are so incredibly common now. They were common in rural areas as well, which is likely where teapots became part of the cottagecore aesthetic. They were also used to brew tea, as you could steep tea leaves in them and let the hot water really soak in all of the flavors and aroma. Teapots came in different shapes and sizes, and you could always experiment and see which one worked the best for you. Salt is really good at quickly cleaning your iron pans. This happens for a few reasons, but two of them are that salt just happens to be inherently very abrasive, and it's also very good at degreasing. This helps food that's stuck on the pan and any grease that also won't go away to come off easily. You don't want to be damaging the surface of your pan after all. Why is salt like that though? Salt happens to be really coarse, and that makes it really good for situations where you would need an abrasive. Sprinkle just a little bit on a hot pan with a bit of leftover oil and start scrubbing with a cloth. You'll see the difference almost immediately, and that's all thanks to the coarseness of salt. Why does salt work as a degreaser? Well, that's because when you use it alongside heat, salt changes its properties a little, as most things do when they come into contact with heat. Now, salt can help to absorb and break down greasy surfaces because it helps draw that grease away. Salt has a lot of good absorption properties too. It's really good at taking away moisture from other liquids and oils. It's also good for preventing some rust, but that's a little side tip I'm including for free. Share your favorite trick in the comments, like the video if it brought back a memory, and subscribe so these old kitchen secrets keep finding new homes.